Okay, we are now live.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to wait to see if some of the attendees that are usually lined up start to populate, and give it a few seconds, and then we'll go ahead and start the meeting this month. All right, it looks like people are starting to come on in. All right, we'll get started. So good evening and welcome everybody to the March 1st, 2021 Community Advisory Council meeting. My name is Evan Zelig. I am the elected chair. Unfortunately, Lorena, our vice chair, is not able to join us this evening, but she did send her regards to everybody, and she does anticipate being back shortly. Thank you to everybody for being here this week, and especially to our panelists that we will get to in very short time. If anybody would like a Spanish translation, please raise your digital hand on the Zoom app. Si hay alguien que necesita traducción en español, por favor, suba la mano. And I don't see anything raised. Let me just check. I do not see any hands raised requesting a Spanish translation. Adriana, do you know if we received any requests in advance for Spanish this month?
We did not.
Okay, so if we happen to have that request come up, we will address it at that time. I don't see any request at this time. From your agendas, you can see that members of the public are free to address the CAC. Public comment will be taken during our meeting as well as at the end. Public comments are taken after each agenda item, and those will be relating to only that agenda item. Public comment taken at the end will be for the subject matter of the CAC and can be on any topic as long as it is within our typical subject matter jurisdiction. Oral public comment on agenda items is available during CAC meetings. We also invite the public to communicate with us, the Iolero staff, the CAC members, through email. Members of the public who would like to make statements that may exceed time limits for public comment, which is typically 3 minutes, should email their suggestions or questions to cac@sonoma-county.org. CAC members may not deliberate or take action on items not on the agenda, and generally for public comment may only listen. Should CAC members wish to deliberate on an issue that is raised during public comment, we can place that on the agenda for a future agenda item at a later date. So please, if there is one of our members or more of our members who want a specific topic on the agenda, please do let us know and we can make sure that we add that for the future. Materials related to items on the agenda submitted to the CAC are available for public inspection at the Iolero office during normal business hours. I am going to do the roll call today since Lorena is not present. Let's see who we have here. Member Alma Roman Diaz. Adriana, have we heard from Alma today?
Sorry, Evan, I just got a text from her and she has a family emergency. She will not be able to attend.
Okay, so Alma will not be able to attend. Thank you for letting us know. Dora Barrera.
Present.
And rather Dora Estrada now. Welcome. David Hernandez has informed us he cannot be present. He is not present. Jose Landaverde.
Present.
Lorena Barrera is not present. And Lorez Bailey.
Present.
And Chair Evan Zelig is present as well. I do note that we don't appear to have any agenda items requiring any votes on the agenda today. So we are operating with less people than we normally do. We do have 3 people missing. However, it does not appear that we are taking any actions requiring votes for today's meeting. Are there any changes to the agenda that anybody has at this time? Okay. I will note one, for our panel discussion, Abby Tardy, who is one of our interns from Sonoma State University, she was intending to present some research findings relating to the intern research on Lexipol versus non-Lexipol policies. Unfortunately, she is unable to attend to present that today. Adriana will forward Abby's report to the CAC members such that we can consider that report as part of our research on these issues. And of course, if Abby is available, we can email her for questions if we have them, but she will not be able to present that report at today's meeting. I think that's the only change on our agenda. What I will do now is open up for brief public comment regarding the approval, the intended approval of the minutes of last meeting. And I just want to, well, let me check. Adriana, do we have the enough people present to vote on approval of the minutes who were also here last time?
Yes, sorry, I was doing a visual check.
Okay.
You do have 4 members that were at the last meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. I am going to open up for brief public comment. We're going to reserve this for 2 minutes each. And again, this is only relating to today's agenda or the minutes or comments on last minute's agenda prior to our approval of those minutes. Is there anybody who wishes to make public comment at this time? Please raise your hand on the app and we will get you in. Okay, I see no hands raised or anybody who is wanting to make public comment. Thank you. We will now move to approving the minutes from the last meeting. Of the CAC members who are now present, is there a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
I move that we approve the minutes from the February 1st meeting.
I second.
Thank you, Lorez, and thank you, Dora. All those in favor of approval of the minutes from February 1st meeting, say aye.
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 And I heard 4 ayes. Are there any opposed? Please say no or nay. Okay, hearing none, the minutes from the last agenda are approved. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to get into right into our panel discussion today. That's what we had reserved for today, and we do have some fantastic panelists who are here to both provide us with some information on Lexipol and as well as answer some questions. The questions have been sent to our panelists in advance, and as well as the questions we sent them in advance. If anybody on the CAC has any additional questions, we will open it up at the appropriate time for that purpose. So the first thing I want to do is just give read the bios of our panelists. And then what we'll do is we'll open up our, we'll go through each panelist and see if they have anything that they'd like to present to us, or if they simply want us to get into questions and we can begin our panel and ask our questions. So the first person that we have joining today is Bill McAuliffe. Bill is the Director of Professional Services at Lexipol. We next have Annie Hudson Price. She is a senior staff attorney for the NYU School of Law's a policing project. The policing project partners with communities and police so that the public can participate in the process of creating policing policies and practices. The policing project has worked with the New York Police Department to provide community feedback on the body-worn camera policy, as well as with the Los Angeles Police Department on their video release policies. Before joining the policing project, Annie was a core member of Public Counsel's nationally recognized Opportunity Under the Law project, where she brought impact litigation throughout the country to advance economic justice and civil rights. She began her legal career as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, advocating for alternative sentencing on behalf of justice-involved veterans and foster youth. She graduated cum laude from Yale College and Harvard Law School, and we do welcome Annie Hudson Price. The next person on our panel is Joanna Schwartz. Joanna is a professor of law at UCLA School of Law. She teaches civil procedure and a variety of courses on police accountability and public interest lawyering. Professor Schwartz is one of the country's leading experts on police misconduct litigation and co-authored a Texas law review regarding Lexipol titled Lexipol, The Privatization of Police Policymaking. That was a 2018 Texas Law Review article. She has also authored multiple articles on qualified immunity and previously clerked for judges in the Southern District of New York, as well as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She is a graduate of Brown University and Yale Law School. We are also joined by Sergeant Dwight Gunn. Sergeant Gunn is from the San Francisco Sheriff's Office. The San Francisco Sheriff's Office historically has not used Lexipol, but is currently transitioning to Lexipol policies. Sergeant Gunn has been with their department for 25 years, and in his current assignment is tasked with transitioning the department to these new Lexipol-based policies. Locally, we have Lieutenant Brandon Cutting. Lieutenant Cutting is from the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. He is also our liaison for the Sheriff's Office and joins us regularly for meetings. Lieutenant Cutting has been with the Sheriff's Office since 2005, serving in a variety of roles from patrol to investigations. He currently manages the Professional Standards Unit, which includes internal affairs, training, policy and use of force review, and is also the Sheriff's Office liaison for Iolero and the CAC. And lastly, but certainly not least at all in this panel, is George Paraveles. Mr. Paraveles has 15 years, more than 15 years of experience in law enforcement oversight, civil rights, and community advocacy. He has served on 2 different police oversight boards, including the Berkeley Police Review Commission and the Bay Area Rapid Transit Police Citizens Review Board. He is active in NACL, in the National Association for Civilian Oversight and Law Enforcement, and has been responsible for the review and writing of 400 plus law enforcement policies. So welcome to all of our panelists. I did want to introduce you all as a panel. And what we'll do now is we'll go through each panelist and see if there is general information that you'd like to provide us on your current work, specifically regarding Lexipol policies. And then we'll open it up to our CAC panel to ask questions, some of which you may have already answered in your presentation, others which you did not. I'd like to first turn to Bill McAuliffe, who is the director of, one of the directors at Lexipol of Professional Services, and ask Bill if he can tell us a little bit about Lexipol and what his job with Lexipol is, as well as, just generally about the Lexipol policies and why you feel it may be a good model for police agencies to adopt as the structure or the basis for beginning their policies. Hi, Bill.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And nice introduction. So there's a lot to unpack there. So to start off with, prior to working for Lexipol, I was a customer of Lexipol. 25 years in law enforcement. I've been with Lexipol for almost 6 years. and run the professional services division here, which is a team of about 47 folks from across the country that work individually with each customer that comes on with Lexipol for policy solutions, and helping them customize and go through the customization process of our master content. Lexipol, if some of you don't know, started back in about 2003. Actually was born and raised in California, with Gordon Graham and Bruce Prayett as the co-founders. They had started doing some work in the 1990s with organizations throughout the state and realized the need for really well-written and standardized policies, and it grew from there. Lexipol has now grown to be an international or a national company. We're in 35 different states for law enforcement, and develop state-specific policies for not only law enforcement, but corrections, probation, and the fire industry. And we also have another division of the company, which is more geared towards training. So we do some training around the policy that we provide, but then also providing empowerment to first responders and public servants across the board to best meet their needs for, safely responding and serving their organizations and their communities. And we do that by using experts in policy and training and wellness to support the first responders and government leaders so that they can address the public safety challenges and improve the communities that they serve.
Thank you. I'd like to open up for any of our CAC members who may have some questions. And again, one of what we're trying to do with this panel is really explore Lexipol and the policies as well as the alternatives to assist us with making recommendations to our own sheriff's office on whether they should be adopting Lexipol policies or moving away from that program. So I'd like to open up now to any of our CAC members who may have questions for Bill about the Lexipol. And I see Jose Landaverde.
Yes. What does Lexipol, what interests are prioritized in the process of creating Lexipol policies?
I would say that the number one priority is the prioritization of life and civil liberties. Our policies are based on, so it's, again, like I said before, it's state specific, but it's going to be based on federal and state statutes and requirements, and then industry best practices. So it's all geared towards having legally defensible policies that best serve the community with the prioritization of life and civil liberties. And it's all based off of settled law and then best practices in that given industry.
And Lorez, did you have a question as well for Bill?
Yeah, Bill, I wanted to ask you a more, what does that look like in that process? For those of us who are, unfamiliar, going to be learning about Lexipol for the first time, what does that look like, or what does that process look like?
The process of creating policy, you mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lexipol, right, is a risk management solution for identifying. So I guess, for someone who is unfamiliar with talking about Lexipol, just for the lay person, what does that mean? What does that look like in terms of getting with law enforcement and supporting those policies?
Sure. So when you talk about risk management and risk mitigation with using policy, it's about setting agencies up to have solid, well-written and defensible policies that can be customized to their specific needs. So they have to be applicable, practical, and functional for their community, their organization. It's not an off-the-shelf, just plug it in and run with it type approach. It is a custom application, just with a really solid, well-vetted base. And that process is, and the creation of the policy is, it's a very collaborative process using legal experts, subject matter experts, technical writers, in a collaborative effort to craft policy that fits that need. And then once we roll that out to the customer, it comes out on our platform. It is fully customizable to their needs. Again, it has to be applicable, practical, and functional for their purposes. And it then gets customized to fit the needs of that organization. And like I said, my team works with agencies to help them do that modification so that it maintains the style and the format so that it continues to have a one author appearance. But again, it's still meeting the needs of the organization that is going to implement it for their purposes.
Bill, I actually have a question. This is Evan Zelig again. In Lexipol writing their policies, both initially as well as when there are changes in law, are you taking any information or reports from outside groups such as the ACLU, the National Institute of Justice, other civil liberties based groups? Are you taking any of their reports or any of their input when forming these Lexipol policies, or is it only people working for Lexipol who are law enforcement background and writing it more from a law enforcement perspective?
That's a great question, and these policies are not written in a vacuum. These are written with influence and consideration of other people's thoughts and ideas. And again, settled law is settled law, but there's also every attorney has an opinion. So there's some good debates amongst our attorneys. We don't hire a bunch of yes men. We actually hire people that have different perspectives and bring in subject matter experts that can lend a different perspective so that we have a very well-rounded discussion on how things should be crafted. And we don't work directly with, the ACLU and other organizations like that, but we certainly read their material and consider their input and their opinion. Just recently we did work with the Innocence Project on redrafting our policies for eyewitness identification because we saw a need there and they had a great interest, so they did partner with us on that. So there are times that we do partner with groups like that, but like I said, nothing is created in a vacuum. We definitely look outside at all the different perspectives and take those into consideration and draft our policy according to.
Once you have a policy drafted for a client or an agency, what type of follow-up is there from Lexipol to find out how that policy is being implemented, and more importantly, whether it's showing some success? Do you follow up with them about their stats to see if the policy is working as intended?
No, we really don't have a mechanism to track that. In essence, we do get feedback. We often say Lexipol is not a vendor, we're a partner, and we truly mean that, in that we do take feedback from the customer. So any feedback that we get from the customer goes back to the individual or the team that has oversight for that area, whether it be legal or content or even our IT platform. And the way that we've been able to improve and grow as a company is absolutely listening to the voice of the customer. And that voice of the customer is very, very important to us. So that feedback that we get through the customer gives us an idea of where we're doing well and where we need to improve or what they would like to see different. But we don't have a mechanism to say how well they've implemented or how well that policy has served them. That is something better monitored at the organizational level. We just don't have a mechanism for that.
Have you heard from some of your clients about policies or parts of the Lexipol policy that have not working? And if so, how is that corrected? How is that changed for future policies or future clients?
Well, the beautiful thing about our system and our platform is that everything is, like I said, it's fully customizable. So the customer has 100% creative control. So if they find something in the policy, again, that is not on point with how they operate or what is best suits their community, then they absolutely have the right to go in and are actually instructed to by us as a best practice to go in and, again, make it applicable, practical, and functional for their use. If they point out something that they feel is contrary to state law or federal law or best practice, they often bring it back to us saying, hey, this is what it says in your policy, but this is my understanding of how it should really be applied or how it should be written. And we do have dialogue to help them get through that or maybe see it from the right perspective. Or again, my team helps a lot with helping them reword that and wordsmith it so that it meets their needs. Like I said, it's not that off the shelf Lexipol dictating how you should run your organization. It's just that really solid foundation for the agency then to customize to their needs and as they see fit.
Lorez, I saw your hand raised. Did you have another question?
Yes, I did.
Great.
Thank you, Bill. Another question that I had is you talk about the customer. So I'm assuming, when you say the customer, you're talking about those law enforcement agencies. Is there any part of that process, any input from the local community or the public? And if so, can you give us an example of how that created a policy just because of that input?
I can't say that any public input has created a policy, but I can tell you there's several agencies across the country that we've worked with that have embedded members of the citizenry in their review and assessment of policy as to how to best craft it for their needs. Some agencies will have a group such as yourself that have a large committee, and they'll use that, or they'll bring in an individual from the community that can then liaison with a larger community group. And we've always recommended that Lexipol do a collaborative process and involve other members, whether it be from the citizenry or other divisions of your organization or what have you, to get that 360-degree perspective on what is best for that policy and how you're going to craft it and then implement it later. Again, it's so specific to each individual community and organization that you have to have that depth of analysis and input. Again, that 360-degree perspective to make sure that you're going to best serve your community with the policy.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Oh, Dora, yes, thank you.
I have one more question.
Please.
How often are policies changed if it's not due to a law change? Does that happen frequently, or does it happen only once in a while?
So there's a lot of different sources of change. One of the benefits of partnering with Lexipol is, and having a Lexipol subscription, is that we do monitor all the different potential sources of change from the federal, state, and best practice level, so industry level, and then state and federal statutes and case law, court decisions, you name it. So we have a whole team of people that monitor those and then evaluate those pieces of legislation and evaluate whether they do impact policy to create a change. And if we do find something that should trigger a change, regardless of how large or small that might be, then they craft the language that we then recommend through our platform. We push that out to the agency's draft manual. We don't change anything in their issued manual. That's totally up to the agency. We push that out to their draft manual for them to then see what we're recommending they change that language to be within that standard. And then they, again, have that creative control to either accept the update as it is and just slide the language right into their new policy and issue it out, or they can modify it and then roll it out into their issued manual, or they can just reject it. If it's not applicable to them, they can just reject that update. The other source of change is from the agency themselves. So one of the other services that my team provides is if an agency keeps us on after the implementation process, we also provide what we call management services. And through that management services service, we provide them assistance in making any modification to their policy manual. So it could be from within that they decide they're going to make a command change and they're going to change something. It could be citizen group gets with the police chief or the sheriff and they decide that they're going to change something. Regardless of the source of change, my team will be there to help them do that wordsmithing, make sure that it fits into the policy, help them put it in the right place, because sometimes they might place it in somewhere in the manual that isn't quite applicable or practical. So we'll give them that guidance and help do that wordsmithing, not on the content as to what it says and what point they're trying to get across, but again, keeping it within our style and format so that the manual continuously looks like one person wrote it, but it has to say what they need it to say for that purpose. So a lot of different sources of change, but that's how we help the agencies keep their manual current.
And Bill, following up on that, this is Evan Zelig again. For example, if you have several of your customers who are taking the step as a department to, for example, ban the carotid hold, where those departments have decided we're no longer going to use the carotid restraint as our new policy. Is that something that Lexipol will take note of and, for example, send out an update to the rest of your clients indicating that, these 10 departments have now banned the use of the carotid hold. Will you make recommendations that future agencies also take those same steps? Or when you see those trends, do you kind of let each agency make its own decisions?
Yeah, that's fully up to each individual agency. Now, like in the state of California, when the governor put out the administrative notice saying that they weren't going to teach it anymore, it's not going to be authorized in the state of California, then we did work with members in the state and had conversations with the Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association, a lot of other groups in the state, and we crafted alternative language for agencies to put into their manual. So if they're going to take it out completely in states like California, then there was alternative language there. There's other places where they're not going to take it out completely, but they wanted to make it so that the carotid hold was only used in deadly force type incidents. So they raised the level and made it very clear as to when it could or cannot be used. So yeah, we do help craft that language and then help agencies roll that into their policy manual.
But that is initiated by the agency. For example, when California put out that alert, Lexipol doesn't send, for example, like an email alert or a notice to all of its customers, announcing that California has taken this measure and to review policy. You don't kind of give that direction. It's all based on what they want to do and what changes the agency wants to make, correct?
No, we actually sent out a notice saying that, hey, we noted that the governor made this change, or the state legislation changed, or what have you, and this is the recommended language that we have crafted for you to consider, and then it's up to the agency to determine what they do with that.
And
so that's one of the things. Sorry, real quick.
Yeah.
That's one of the things we hear from chief executives across the board in every industry that we serve across the country is the value of Lexipol is us monitoring those potential sources. So last year alone, our team reviewed over 4,000 pieces of legislation. Now, not every one of those created a change in policy, but we still monitored for that. And so for an agency to take that on themselves and to monitor all those things in a timely fashion would be an insurmountable project. So that's the benefit that we see all the time from chief executives, that we keep that open eye and we do the monitoring and then also help them craft that language that they might need for their policy manual.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions from our CAC members before we go on to another panelist and get some more information? All right, Bill, we may come back to you with additional questions, but thank you very much for that
Perfect.
information as well. Thank you. I'm going
bet.
to go to the East Coast now. Annie Hudson Price is here. Annie, I wanted to open it up to you to find out a little bit more about the work you do for NYU's policing project, find out a little bit about that project, and we'll open it up to questions afterwards. And yeah, Annie, if you could tell us a little bit about your project.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. First, the Policing Project, we're a team of community organizers, lawyers, social scientists, and academics. And as you mentioned before, we partner with both police and communities to promote public safety. And core to our mission is the principle that true public safety is dependent on democratic accountability. And right now, when most people talk about accountability in policing, what they're talking about is what we call back-end accountability. So something goes wrong, Breonna Taylor gets killed, and we look to the courts to hold that individual party accountable. But that clearly hasn't been working. However you define working, it's not working. The state of our country right now and the tensions show it is not working. And B, it is completely backwards to provide guidance only after something horrible has happened. That's not how we do it in any other section of government. So, we seem to recognize this with pretty much every other government agency, and policing agencies are that, they are government agencies. And for example, we don't say to a health inspector, go make sure things look healthy, and we'll tell you after the fact whether or not you had the right definition of sanitary. They're told when, where, and how they can do health inspections. They're told what the definition of compliance is. And only in policing do we sort of say, go enforce the law. Here are some really loose standards, and we'll tell you after the fact if you've gone too far. And policing projects, we consider this even more egregious, given that we provide the least amount of guidance to an agency to which we confer the most amount of power, the power to use force, the power to surveil. And our experience has been that this system is unfair to pretty much everyone involved, not just the communities that are being disproportionately impacted when something goes wrong, but it's unfair to the officers who are in the field with very little guidance and who are now in our current state where there's very little job satisfaction because they're being blamed. There's no sense of connection to communities. We've created this environment where no one's winning. And until we sort of bring democratic accountability into policing, we're going to continue to have community police tensions. That's sort of central to our mission. And our experience has been when communities are brought in, no community wants Graham as the standard. No community wants a 1989 Supreme Court case that gave very broad definition of what is considered acceptable to be the community's goal. So, one thing we've experienced is when you actually work with the communities and agencies, we help draft the Camden use of force policy. When you give more guidelines, when you engage the community, one of the primary things you see happen is use of force complaints go down. Providing more guidance doesn't create more litigation. So if that's your concern, you want to decrease incidents, not to decrease the ability for the community to hold those who engage in excessive force accountable. So that's sort of a baseline of where we're coming from and what we do. The last thing I'll say is you don't need community engagement for every single policy. Police manuals are huge, but there are some key ones that of course you're going to want community engagement in. We're talking about use of force a lot today. There's also going to be consent searches. There are a few others. We're not saying you need to engage the community on every single policy that you promulgate, but there are key ones that are just essential if we want to move forward.
Can you tell us a little bit more specifically? You mentioned the Camden County use of force policy. Can you tell us how that use of force policy, what steps were taken to essentially redo and redraft it, and how it is different from other use of force policies? What makes it unique in that regard?
So first I'll say, I don't know that it is that unique anymore. I think actually a lot of big agencies have similar policies. The Camden chief came to the policing project. He is the former head of PERF, so he personally was very well versed in best practices. And we worked with them to get a draft based on best practices. And then we engaged, we spoke to both the ACLU and the presidents of the FOP. So it isn't when we say community engagement, we're not coming from you can only engage the ACLU and that's the end of the conversation. It's truly community engagement, and every community is going to have a different representative of what is community engagement.
Were the unions, were the union participants, were they involved in the new policy changes and drafting of the new policy? How did they receive? We hear a lot about police unions protecting the policies and being very against the change of policies with community input. How did you find your experience working with those unions?
So first I'll say, you get notes from both the ACLU and you get notes from the FOP, and the agency is the one that, not dissimilar to what you've been hearing, the agency is the one that makes the final decision. So it's getting the input is key. You're not gonna be able to make every single change that every single person wants, but you can incorporate those. And our experience was that actually there isn't that far to go when it comes to some of the most basic things. The reality is officers want more guidance often in the field. There's going to be tension, and that is something that has to be resolved. But if you buy the agency, but getting that buy-in, just giving a voice to everyone involved, that alone can make a huge difference in this process. I should say I personally was not the one engaged with the union, so I can find out more information and get back to you on what their exact experience was. But
thank you. Now, obviously, the Camden use of force policy, that I say obviously, it's not obvious. That was not a Lexipol policy. That was a drafted from scratch policy that the policing project assisted with.
Yeah, and they had a Graham baseline policy. They had a policy that was just the constitutional baseline, and there was a lot of community call for something more. And so, yeah, we were brought in. There are a lot of baseline model policies that are at a much higher level than Graham already. There are tons of sample policies out there. And there are a lot of organizations, police organizations, doing best practices that go a lot farther than Graham.
Is there a reason that your group chose to essentially modify and go this route as opposed to taking a Lexipol policy and modifying with Lexipol? What was it about Lexipol that your organization looked at and said, that's not how we want to do it. We need to do it this way? What about Lexipol was something you didn't want to adopt?
So I'll say, there are fellows within our organization that spend a lot of time doing, DOJ consent decree implementations. And our experience has been Lexipol's incredibly broad definition of reasonable does not provide any guidance to law enforcement. It's the Graham standard. And when you have 30 different factors that an officer may or may not consider in the field, that is not going to help the officer in the field. And it's certainly not what the communities we've worked with want. And so there are so many model policies, and we're just talking use of force right now. But across the board, we found that people wanted more guidance. And I'm not saying there was any affirmative decision not to use Lexipol. I don't even know that was brought up, but I do know our partners who have done consent decrees have found that to be a real issue and have not, it has not been a great deal of support in expanding the definition of adding greater restrictions when if they have wanted to modify. So again, just talking about use of force, but.
And again, regarding that Camden use of force policy, what was the process that you took to get the community input? Was that done just with a community survey? Did you have meetings with the police board or police, similar to these oversight meetings? What was the policy to get that community input and then be able to present it to the agency?
So first I'll say I think the agency, it's not happening one and then the other. It's sort of, we're working with the agency, but the agency itself is hearing complaints from the community. And if the agency is meaningfully engaged in actually looking at what the community is saying and reviewing those complaints, there's already information there. So we try and incorporate that before it's introduced before we solicit feedback. So, for our body worn camera a policy, there was a lot of community engagement through surveys and other avenues. For the use of force policy, there was so many community complaints and information that it was already gathered that we sort of incorporated that and best practices to draft the policy. And then with that model draft, we went to the ACLU, the FOP, and community leaders and asked for notes and tried to incorporate as much as was reconcilable. And again, obviously, it was ultimately up to the agency to solidify. But across the board, it was really, here's more guidance, here's clearer standards and definition.
And so it sounds like the agency, Camden County itself, the agency, the government, and the police agency, they were fully involved and motivated to make policy changes based on community input and democratic participation.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say it wasn't hugely labor intensive in this situation. The chief of police was the former head of PERF, so there was a lot of knowledge already. But it was also, this was a situation in which there were leaders in the community who had emerged, who were the lead voices on this, that were engaged. It wasn't the same as with our body worn camera policies. But I mean, the bottom line is some community engagement is better than none. And there are various levels at which you can engage community members.
Thank you. Are there any CAC members who have additional questions for Annie Hudson Price?
I have a question. Annie, I think you mentioned that after the policy was modified, complaints actually went down. Do you have any sense or statistics or data that you can refer to generally about what that reduction looked like?
Yeah, so in 2014 was when the complaints about excessive force were at their highest. I believe there was an internal revision in 2015, and then we helped a full revision in 2019. So between 2014 and 2020, they went down 95%. So it was an enormous reduction from their first revision and then in the second one. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much as good as you can get. One last thing I would like to say is I think we're all in this situation because state legislatures aren't acting. The real thing we need is state level comprehensive use of force policies. That is something else the policing project does. And we do have model statutes if that's something anyone's interested in.
Yeah, I think certainly we'd be interested in seeing if you're able to forward those, the model
Absolutely.
statutes and the model policies. I think would be wonderful as we do this research. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our next panelist. And of course, if any of our CAC members think of questions that apply to previous panelists, just let me know. They're still here. We can open things up for them again. I'd like to now turn to Joanna Schwartz. She is a UCLA law professor. And if you could tell us a little bit about the work you do specifically relating to Lexipol, and we'll go from there. I know we do have some questions as well.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I do a lot of research about police accountability and have published an article with a co-author about Lexipol, which is the sort of the first law review article, but extended article that examines Lexipol, how it works. And it's available at Texas Law Review online, texaslawreview.org/Lexipol. And I hope that you can take a look at it because it certainly can provide you with more information than I can in the time that we have together. And I'm happy to provide you the PDF as well. What I would say is what we found through public records requests to the 200 largest law enforcement agencies in California, that Lexipol is a dominant figure providing services to 95% of California law enforcement agencies, and they do provide services to so many people because for the reasons that Bill described, they are an efficient service. You can press a button and you will get updates. You are provided with information about updates when they happen, and technologically that is very straightforward and easy to use, particularly for smaller departments. But we also came away with more concerns about the company than we did feeling promise for its potential. And I would put those concerns in a couple of different categories. One is that their materials talk about risk management and benefiting communities writ large. But the bottom line in their promotional materials is about reducing legal liability, about reducing the payouts in these cases, reducing officer liability. And the focus on reducing officer liability goes hand in hand with a strong interest in maintaining maximum officer discretion. And they repeatedly talk about the importance of maintaining maximum officer discretion. And what that translates into, connected to the point that Annie had made a moment ago, Graham versus Connor is a Supreme Court decision that is very broad in terms of the standards for exercising force. It says courts should look at the totality of the circumstances, don't look at it from 2020 hindsight, and creates what legal scholars have considered to be very fuzzy rules that don't provide guidance. PERF has said that we need stronger standards than Graham versus Connor. Decades of legal research has shown that when there are more restrictive policies, that shootings go down, uses of force go down. And Lexipol is vigorously opposed to any constraints on use of force that go beyond Graham. If you look at their materials, they repeatedly talk about the importance of maintaining Graham as the standard that's been in place for 30 years and doesn't need to be replaced. You will also see that California, recently passed AB 392, which created an effort to create a restriction above Graham, that it was only to use force when necessary. Bruce Prayett and Lexipol vigorously opposed that statute. They talked about it resulting in large verdicts against law enforcement officers and agencies. They called it bad for law enforcement and the legal system. And then when AB 392 was finally passed, there was some compromise in the bill, and some of the language was weakened in the way in which they defined what amounted to necessary. Lexipol was involved in those efforts to reduce the language in that statute. They wrote a message to their California subscribers and said that the bill had improved because of changes that, quote, we were able to convince the legislature to add. And then they have been in their trainings to their providers, have told their own members that this new statute, AB 392, has not changed anything, that Graham remains the standard. This is what their engagement has been related to this issue about use of force standard in Graham. And there's been a similar, you can see there's been, in the past recent months, there have been many efforts to make use of force policies more restrictive, to have bright line rules, to mandate de-escalation, to have use of force matrices. And Lexipol has been speaking out against those kinds of efforts. And so this is a concern for me, both in terms of the way in which the focus on the focus has been on reducing legal liability, and then the sort of companion focus on maximizing officer discretion. I also think that they, at least based on our research that was published in 2018, it is difficult to have community engagement through these policies. Lexipol does consult with other organizations, has gotten information from the ACLU and other organizations, but the product is the choice that they make among the various policy options. And when they do make a choice among policy options, they don't provide their subscribers with what the alternatives were, or that there was a debate. So to take one example, there is a debate among law enforcement about whether it is appropriate to show officers video body cam footage before interviewing them when there has been an officer involved shooting. That is a subject for which there is significant debate, and law enforcement agencies across the country have taken different paths. Lexipol is of the position that officers should be able to see video before they are interviewed by internal affairs related to an officer involved shooting. And that is their policy. But at least, as of the time that I have last looked at this, nowhere in their materials do they recognize and note that there is a diversity of opinion about this, that many agencies don't allow their officers to view these videos, and that there are good, sensible reasons for that, and that they're choosing this alternative policy, and here's their justification for that. And so without that kind of full information, it's very hard for an agency, particularly this kind of small agency that is hoping that Lexipol will do some of that work for them. It's very hard for that agency then to know what the alternatives are, what choices are being made for Lexipol. And one final thing from our prior research, our understanding was that when an agency wanted to customize their policies, that when there was an update, those customizations would fall out. So they would have to be input yet again. It may be that that has changed since 2018, but that was our understanding when we spoke to subscribers and to Lexipol representatives in doing that research.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of fantastic information. I'm going to open it up to our CAC to see if anybody has some follow-up questions for Joanna about her comments. Dora?
Sorry. Do you know of any alternatives to Lexipol that might be doing it a little different as what you just explained?
Well, so, you know, one example is a place like the Policing Project, which is, you know, has been doing this this kind of work. I am not aware of other entities that do this kind of, that have the sort of tech platform that Lexipol does. But there are many other groups that are developing policies like the Policing Project.
If, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Dora, please.
So if, for example, our agency wants to use Lexipol and they're going to keep using Lexipol, what do you recommend that, how do you recommend that we improve that process with using Lexipol within our own agency?
Well, I guess what I would say is there is still an ability, I suppose there's, if you are using Lexipol, there, you know, I would encourage community engagement about the terms of the policies, and I would, you know, there was this is excerpted in the article from 2018, but there was an insurance group that basically said, advised their municipal clients, if you are going to use Lexipol, do not assume that it is providing you with policies that are consistent with what you are wanting. And so you really need to take a very critical eye to those policies. You know, the danger and the trouble, to my mind, is that is a hard thing to do for a small agency. And so simply saying, you know, we'll take care of this without, you know, without the assistance of a place like the Policing Project or someone, you know, makes it difficult to do that work. And part of my concern with Lexipol is they don't make it, to my belief, they don't make it easy to have those engagements and make those adjustments.
Thank you. Joanna, what would you recommend for a law enforcement agency that is using Lexipol, but is considering either leaving Lexipol completely or, you know, just using it as kind of that base and then significantly modifying it? What would you suggest to an agency that isn't real sure which way to go, keeping Lexipol, getting rid of it? You know, obviously the reduction of legal liability for an agency is huge. At the same time, looking at the stats that Annie gave us, where they're reducing reports by 90+%, 95%, you know, looking at that as a law enforcement agency, maybe, you know, both sides of that looks great on both ends. What would you say for an agency who's trying to make that tough decision?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, and one thing that I and my co-author have really encouraged, is that agencies that are trying to decide whether to stay with Lexipol or join Lexipol ask hard questions of Lexipol. So ask for the underlying data around their statements that they reduce legal liability. You know, they have PowerPoints, but I've not seen the data. So you know, it's you know, to be able to try to compare apples and oranges, to at least get a better sense of what those apples and oranges look like, to understand data like what Annie has offered, and what Lexipol offers, to really understand what it is that you're looking at in terms of the impact and what the proven impact is. I do think that some law enforcement agencies have subscribed to Lexipol as a resource, but then write their own policies. And I do think that there's of course, it's an extra step of work, but I think that there is a value in that if you want the comfort of knowing that you're getting the legal updates, or if there has been a change in the law, that is something that you are getting information about. But again, it is one source of information. In my perspective, it is a source that is focused primarily on reducing legal liability and maintaining maximum officer discretion. And so viewing it as such, it could be a component, something that was consulted. But if those are not the guiding interests or the sole interests that you are hoping to advance, I would make it just one piece of the puzzle.
Thank you very much. Okay, again, do any of our other CAC members have questions for Joanna at this time? Okay, we're going to move on to our next panelist. Thank you so much. If you could stay available, we may have follow-up questions, and I know our public certainly may have comments as well. Okay, Mr. Perez Velez, I'm going to save you for last, if you don't mind. What I'd like to do now is turn to our two law enforcement representatives here. First, I would like to go to the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, Sergeant Dunn. Sergeant Dunn, you are in a jurisdiction that is now moving away from your own policies and to the Lexipol system. As somebody who's been with that department for 25 years, if you could please tell us a little bit about why that decision was made to now shift to Lexipol, as opposed to revision and modification of your own policies internally, or with, for example, the use of the policing project or groups like it who can take the community's input and other input and help the departments with their policies. To tell us a little bit about your decisions and why that came to be.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. So I've been working as a side gig, for lack of a better term, with policy and procedure with myself and about 9 other sworn and professional staff for the last 10 or 15 years on the policy and procedure committee. Full disclosure, I was against Lexipol when we were first told we were going to go to it. A lot of time was spent on, but before shifting to this Lexipol, a lot of time was spent on just trying to keep up with what was going on legally, even with best practice, consulting with our training individuals and everything, but we thought we had a handle on it. But we didn't. And especially when, with like SB 978 coming down the pipe, where you have to publish all of your policies and everything, we had stuff that was written in 1993 that really hadn't been updated, even though it should have. We had all these different silos that were coming up with their own policies for the same thing. For instance, handcuffing. I believe there was 5 handcuffing policies and a memo, and nobody knew what, the policies were slightly different depending on where you were working, in the jails, out of the jails. We had over 1,500 different policies, and we couldn't keep track of it. So the one thing with Lexipol was we gave them all of our policies and said, okay, here's our 1,500 policies. Let's fit those into what you have and see what comes back. You might say it comes out the other side. And we cut it from, again, about 1,500 policies down to around 326, 330 policies that are clearly written, as Bill had said, have the same appearance of authorship. With some of these policies, you can tell who wrote it by the choice of words and everything, and the grammar and everything like that. The hard part, though, is personalizing it for your department or where you're at. Down to things, but you have to do that. I think so. I think some of the agencies that have got into trouble were the ones that just took it off the shelf and treated it that way. I believe the part of the department's decision to go with something like Lexapol, and there really isn't anything else, as Joanna said, that does it on such a wholesale plane, was it was cheaper, I think, to pay a subscription service and have maybe myself and one other person working on it full time, rather than I couldn't even imagine how many man hours are being spent every year in the past just trying to keep up. Forget coming up with new policies or best practices, just trying to keep up with what is out there. But again, I go back to, you have to personalize it. What we do in San Francisco, they don't do in Bakersfield or Kern County, right or wrong. The way I think about it is the penal code is the same throughout the state, but how it's implemented and interpreted and enforced is very different from agency to agency. Good, bad, or indifferent. So that is one thing. And what Joanna was saying is, when there is an update, yes, Lexapol says, here's policy XYZ, and all of your language is gone. So you have to take the time and go back through, and they give you like a red line version. And we go, we're not going to take this, and we're going to put this here. Even things as simple as Lexapol uses he or she. We go with they and their. Even things, so we do look at it, or right now it's for the most part me, look at it as granularly as we can. I think avoiding risk or risk management is a good thing. And I have to admit, I've never thought about it of it being as broad as possible. I think as much as the deputies complain about it, for lack of a better term, they want direction and they want to be able to look it up. And that's also what Lexapol gives you. You can do it online, you can use it on a phone. For instance, I haven't worked in the field in quite some time. If you were talking about field identification, I was just working on that. I really wouldn't know what the current law is, but if I went to, let's say, do an overtime shift out in the field, and this came up when Lexapol was up and running, I could just open up my phone and in essence use their version of Google in field identification or use of force, or you have someone that's been in an admin and goes back to jail. I have a female arrestee that says she's pregnant. What am I supposed to do? With what we have right now, there's a memo about how to treat, how to restrain pregnant females. Now it's part of the policy. You don't have to remember, oh yeah, that memo that Chief Hennessy put out 12 years ago, it said something about that. It's all there. So that's one of the selling points for us. Like I say, I was against going that way, but I don't have a better idea, to be quite honest.
Thank you very much, Sergeant. Question from me. You mentioned that you're moving towards Lexapol. You've been able to go from 1,500 to about 326 policies. One of the benefits is that you can then modify it and make them personal to your jurisdiction. About how much of the Lexapol policy, about what percentage are you then changing and making it, more personal to San Francisco. Once you have that Lexipol policy, how much are you changing?
It really depends on the policy. And I'm not trying to skirt the question, but it really depends on the policy. Right now, we're going through meet and confer with our unions over all of the policies. And in 95% of the policies, there is no change in work condition. It's just that perhaps it's worded differently. And again, or you're taking 5 policies and melding them into one, we're not going to take that part, we're going to take this part and come up with something new. So it's hard to say, what percentage. If I had to go with something, maybe I'm just looking at the updates, because even though we're trying to get this implemented, we're also keeping up with the updates. I would say we keep 75 to 80% of whatever updated language comes through Lexipol.
Thank you. I know you just mentioned that with each policy you're meeting and conferring with the police unions. Has there been, after the switch to Lexipol, or as part of this process in making these modifications, have you opened it up as well to community input to both address or speak on the policy changes and recommendations before you do implement some of those changes?
You know what? We have not. I think part of that reason is we've taken things that we have in place and are just, you might say, rewording them, cleaning them up. And also San Francisco is very unique in that, the city and county is one and the same. And the police department does the majority of the patrol function. Most of the patrol or community where we're out and about with the community is around City Hall, San Francisco General Hospital. So in the grand scheme of things, we don't have as much contact or interaction with the public. However, I don't know if our command staff has ever thought of it, but I don't think they would be opposed to the issue.
Before, you did mention that you had about 1,500 policies for the San Francisco Sheriff's Department. When you previously had to create policies, what was that procedure before? You mentioned you were on the Policy and Procedures Committee, which you said sounds like 10 individuals. Can you tell us about that committee and previously to Lexipol, how that committee would make new policy?
That was part of the problem, is every time something came up, we made a new policy. And that's how we got to 1,500 policies. Part of the difference in thinking in Lexipol is, no, you don't need a new policy. It's probably addressed somewhere. Or the policy itself is broad, and each individual, let's say location or facility, then has their own procedures or what we call post orders. There was a lot of policies that were created that we had no input on, none whatsoever. I guess for the most part, the policies that we worked on were the ones for the general department, not necessarily always ones for what we call custody in jail or field, which for the most part was like City Hall or San Francisco General Hospital. Now it's all under one umbrella, where everything gets shoved through the same funnel, so to speak, or meat grinder, depending on the process.
Sure. Thank you. Are there any other CAC questions for Sergeant Gunn? Okay, Sergeant, I actually had one more. Yeah. It sounds like the main reason that you said was, trying to keep up with everything, and just really Lexipol makes it easier. Because of how big your department is, how many policies you had, the goal of shrinking it down. In the determination of moving to Lexipol, were you looking at any other alternatives besides Lexipol, or was that really the only alternative because of their technology and kind of how they operate?
I don't know what that decision-making process was. We were just told we're going to Lexipol, just to be honest. So I don't know what command staff research was done.
You were not part of the group as far as evaluating whether to move or not. That was kind of a decision made above your decision.
That is correct.
Okay.
One other thing that hasn't come up that I have to admit I also like about Lexipol is they have what they call our daily training bulletins.
Okay.
Which once this goes live, there's 30 what they call DTBs, daily training bulletins, that are come out every month. You can just ask for Lexipol to feed them to you, or if you have a certain part of some operation that is problematic, and it's well, to use my analogy with handcuffing a pregnant female, it could be something as simple as tomorrow's daily training bulletin is true or false. Is a pregnant arrestee or detainee handcuffed in the back? True or false? The answer is false. They aren't. But it would give you the answer, and also touch on the policy where it says you're not supposed to do that and why. And so it keeps everyone engaged. The way we have it set up, it's going to be every single employee has to read and acknowledge every single daily training bulletin. So whether you're a deputy working in a jail, working at SFGH, if you're a clerk at the Central Warrants Bureau, you have to read it also. And our hope is that gives everyone in the department, from the cadet to to clerk typists to deputies, an idea of what we do and why. And there's no way we could do that on our own. It's just well, you could if you had enough people, and we just don't have that kind of staff.
Great. Thank you very much, Sergeant. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
I'd like to move on now to Lieutenant Brandon Cutting. He's with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. Lieutenant Cutting, if you could please talk to us about the Sheriff's Office and why a decision was made to implement Lexipol's policies, and what the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office does with those policies, either whether they're modified by a committee, how that essentially the baseline policies are then implemented in Sonoma County. If you could give us some information about that.
Yeah, so the Sheriff's Office has had some association with Lexipol beginning in about 2007. Probably before then, looking at other agencies that were using Lexipol in their policies. We have about 600 policies department-wide currently, and that's a lot to manage, as Sergeant Gunn said. So initially, the policies we were doing a different level of use with Lexipol, where we would receive their updated new policies, but we were not automatically updating. We were looking at particular policies that we had that needed attention. That process changed for us in about 2015. And that's when we began collecting online updates of policies and reviewing all of our existing policies to all of the Lexipol policies. We adopted the ones that were appropriate and didn't the ones that were not. That process, and I can talk about how a policy is accepted or denied. We receive updates as federal, state laws change from Lexipol. That's the prompted ones, okay? So we'll talk about that first. So we receive an update stating that a law has changed and modifications have been made. We receive from Lexipol, much like Sergeant Gunn said, a lined out copy, which shows our existing policy and the changes that they recommend. We go through and we review as a committee all of the legal implications of those changes. We're going to make sure that they are actually factually correct. And I've never seen one that I disagree with legally. but we want to make sure that they are appropriate for our community. They want to make sure that they're appropriate for our agency, on both sides of law enforcement and attention for the department-wide ones. Once the committee has reviewed it, we send it out to the appropriate unit, specialty, whoever's managing those specialties, use of force, or any particular zone within the sheriff's office, have them review it to make sure it's trainable. We train everybody on all of our policies to make sure that everybody understands. Obviously, policies aren't just there for, it's there for accountability of us and for us. So we have to make sure that we can teach it. It comes back to that committee, and then we do send it out to both of the two sheriff's unions that are involved for meet and confer issues to make sure that they don't affect the working conditions. We get word back from them, and then we push it forward. Our executive management group, which consists of the sheriff and the upper management, then review the changes, and that's where the approvals are made. Once those approvals are made, then we actually affect those changes online. The Lexipol has some great benefits to us, obviously, aside from the federal state laws that change regularly, and they're paying attention to that. We are as well, but I guarantee we would have a very difficult time trying to catch all the nuanced laws that are out there. When the laws were required to be posted, or policies were required to be posted online, having that Lexipol app has really made it so we can do that all across the board with all of our policies. It would be very difficult without that. We would spend a great deal of time making small updates on a regular basis. So those are the push changes. We also change stuff. It's been brought up several times about the carotid restraint. We went in immediately and made a manual change to the carotid restraint in our own policy through the Lexipol app. So we don't necessarily wait for someone to tell us how to do it. We make the decisions based on our community's need and requirement and the law, and really what the sheriff's threshold is going to be on particular issues. So we're able to do that with Lexipol. I think did I answer those questions?
Yeah, yeah, so far. No, go ahead. If you had anything else to add before we ask some additional questions.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. In making the decision to use Lexipol and continuing to use Lexipol, did the sheriff's office research any alternatives, if you know of any, or was Lexipol pretty much the answer given the number of policies and the goal of slimming things down and having those regular updates?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other policy for law enforcement. I know there's a lot of risk policies for corporations and companies that are out there, but law enforcement wise, I'm not familiar with any. If there are, I couldn't tell you if those were reviewed back in the day when we began using Lexipol prior to 2007. I was not involved in those decisions at that time, and I haven't heard of any.
On the when you get these updates from Lexipol, and then you said that people look through it, goes to your union to make sure there's no working conditions changes, and then it's discussed with a group of law enforcement. Are those individuals all law enforcement members, or is there any input from the community before making those policy modifications?
So, I mean, I can speak to our use of force policy. I know I presented the use of force policy to this panel prior to us activating it. There wasn't a large discussion about it at that time. Policies, generally speaking, are embedded in federal and state law, at least the modifications that we've been accepting. We're not opposed to, obviously, meeting with the CAC, and this is sort of the procedure that we've been going through with this group and these breakout groups, is talking about the policies. And we're very open to listening to suggestions. I think our biggest concern in opening it up too wide is we are based on federal and state law, and there's policies and then there's procedures. And everybody that would be a part of those groups needs to understand the difference and how they apply to us, and making sure that we wouldn't want to give somebody the hope that they're going to write an entire policy and then have us come back and say, well, the laws are, you know, written this way and we have to follow these, so we can't adopt those items. So this group has been really helpful for us in being able to look at our policies. This group understands the confines of what we can and cannot change, and it's been, I believe, been very helpful so far. I know we're still working towards a lot of the recommendations, and I believe that a lot of those are forthcoming. So we'll see how those work into our process once we get them.
Thank you. We heard Sergeant Gunn talk about how Lexipol puts out these daily training bulletins for officers and agencies. Does the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office currently take advantage of that and provide those bulletins to its deputies?
No, I believe it's an add-on service, and we don't currently use those.
Lieutenant Cutting, you mentioned that you've made changes based on community needs. Can you point out one example, and how did you figure out those community needs or became aware of those community needs?
I mean, the most obvious one is the one we've already talked about, the crowd restraint. We were in no, we realized what the community was demanding of it. Prior to the governor's comments, governor's declaration, the sheriff took action right away upon seeing what potentially could happen, and he took action and we changed our policy. All of our policies are locally based, and I say that because we have to modify almost every policy to accommodate our department. And our department, frankly, is the community. So everything that when we go through and write our policies, we're taking into account that this is the community. The sheriff's office belongs to the community. So when we're writing them, we're looking at that on every single policy.
Are you making an active effort for the people involved in those changes within the sheriff's department to be diverse, come from different backgrounds?
So the sheriff's office itself, are you talking about our internal process of review? I mean, it's based on the knowledge of the field of the policy. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that the diversity is the priority in looking at the policy. It's the knowledge of the expertise of who has that division. Use of force, again, we'll go back to that because we've talked about it. We have use of force instructors, we have use of force evaluators, and all those people have a piece of the training component for use of force. So those are the people that we go to.
I would like to see more a more importance placed on also personal experiences and not just knowledge. I think that's also very important.
Lieutenant Cutting, do you know if the costs of Lexipol, are those covered by the insurance, by the county's insurance provider?
No, we pay all that. That's out of our, we don't have an insurance provider that pays that for us.
That's out of the sheriff's budget for that service?
Yes, every year we budget for the policies.
Was there a cost analysis provided in what the sheriff's office expects Lexipol will save them in the long term, whether it be insurance costs, lawsuits, litigation fees, settlements? Was there an evaluation as to the costs of continuing to use Lexipol versus making our own policies and using our own policies?
No, you know, I heard the stats earlier about the policy, the new policy versus the old policy. I can only say that our policies have been pretty effective, and yes, you talk about risk. I'd say from the opposite side of that, the accountability side of it, I think they're equal, and I think you have to look at both of them. And I don't have a statistical piece of information to say that something is decreased or increased. I don't know that that exists in our community for the policies, because the policies, a lot of our policies didn't change that much with Lexipol. It was more of the appearance and the formatting that was really more suitable for people to be able to see. They were all formatted the same. So I wouldn't say that we had a significant change in the wording of each policy when we went to Lexipol, so much as the way it was formatted.
Thank you. Ms. Navarro, I saw your hand up as well.
I have a question for Lieutenant Cutting and Sergeant Gunn. I was wondering, you heard Ms. Hudson Price talk about when she was speaking, and I think Professor Schwartz followed up to some extent about the reduction in complaints, and by some extension, I think possibly lawsuits against an agency when using a resource like the NYU Policing Project and getting their input. Do you find that compelling evidence when you're thinking about whether to modify your Lexipol policies, how to modify them or whether to use Lexipol at all? Is that kind of evidence something that you find compelling as you consider what your policies look like?
I can answer that first if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I would say I'd be ignorant if I didn't listen to somebody who's obviously well educated and has a good perspective on an existing policy change in an organization that had a dramatic decrease in use of force complaints. That being said, while she was speaking, I did look at that policy. I think it's a very well written policy. I think it mirrors our policy quite a bit, and I believe she even addressed that at the time that policy was very new and very thorough, and now today I think it's probably a lot of the agencies have adopted very similar language, and I don't know if it's as a result of their writing of that policy. It is a well-written policy. So yeah, I'd say that anybody that wouldn't be willing to listen to somebody that has some statistical data out there, you'd be cutting off your right arm not to hear it. But I would also say that we don't have any specifics about Lexipol that says that Lexipol's policies are bad, are unlawful, and don't hold our deputies accountable.
I would dovetail on to Lieutenant Cutting, where, yeah, I mean, knowledge is power. And at the end of the day, even though we are very fortunate to have very few complaints or lawsuits, even one is one too many. And when you're talking about, well, we besides Lexipol and their subject matter experts, to only look at your subject matter experts as opposed to reaching outside to someone perhaps like Annie or Joanna would just be, well, for lack of a better term, silly. If it's there, why not use it? For God's sakes, you might actually learn something. So I know I mean, I can't speak for our sheriff, but I know our department has no problem reaching outside to find answers or insight.
Thank you. Evan, is it okay? I know we're short on time. Is it okay if I wanted to follow up with Mr. McAuliffe, if you're still there?
Yep, I'm still here.
Thank you. On that same note, you had mentioned earlier that Lexipol consults with legal experts, subject matter experts, people who are well-versed in policy and public wellness training. Can you tell us a little bit about the subject matter experts some of them that you consult with, and what types of backgrounds they may have other than law enforcement backgrounds? Specifically, I mean, are we talking, defense attorneys, people who've been part of projects like the NYU Policing Project? What kind of subject matter experts are you consulting with, if you can tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so the creation of policy content is a different division, so I don't interact directly with those that create our content. My team actually helps agencies implement it and customize it. But I can tell you that we do have an advisory committee that spans a very wide range of experience and knowledge and input. And like I said, we don't look for a bunch of yes people. We look for a good cross section of people that have diverse opinions and experience to bring to the table, so that we can have a very robust, sometimes discussion. And I say we, I'm talking about Lexipol because, like I said, I'm not in that room, but they have very robust discussions about how the policy should be crafted, what it should say, what the legal opinions are, and how the differing opinions of differing attorneys are, vetted out and discussed. And that's how they create the content. So it is a very collaborative process, and it's not like we have a staff of subject matter experts. We have a certain staff of attorneys, and then we have a very wide range of subject matter experts across the different specialties, if you will, in the different verticals of service that we provide. So whether it be law enforcement operations type policy, or custody policy, or fire policy, or probation policy, we have experts in all those different fields. So it's a very collaborative process and wide ranging level of experience and knowledge.
Do you, Mr. McAuliffe, this is Evan Zelig again. Do you have people on those committees that are, I guess, the opposing views? For example, on the probation side, when you're looking at probation policies, do you have people who are, for example, defense attorneys or work with probationers? Do you have those opposing viewpoints on your committees?
We do. And like I said, it's not Lexipol reaching out for people that are going to tell us what we want to hear. It's Lexipol working with people out there in the industry, giving us the information in their position, so that we can have that suited conversation and crafting of policy, not doing it in a vacuum. So yeah, there are defense attorneys, there's prosecutors, there's people with more of a civil background, you name it, we bring them into the conversation. And again, it's a wide range of folks, because just like doctors and attorneys, there's specialties in all different areas. So we bring in a host of different people with those different perspectives. So we have a very well vetted out policy when we're done.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going.
And if I could,
Please.
If I could, real quick, I just want to clarify a couple of things that were talked about earlier. Lexipol, when we do our update process and we push out recommended updates to agencies, again, we don't dictate policy to any agency. Agencies dictate policies for their organization. What we provide them is the recommended language. And then, as Sergeant Gunn said, it comes in in the platform in a side-by-side red-lined version for them to then decide what they want to keep or what they want to modify. So Lexipol doesn't push anything out to the agency users. It goes to the administrative users that have control of policy, for them to have those discussions like Lieutenant Cunning was talking about, where they have those roundtable discussions and craft it to be applicable, practical, and functional for their organization. Lexipol does not dictate any of that policy to the organization.
And following up on what Joanna Schwartz said, in 2008, if for example, the San Francisco sheriffs made some modifications to suggested language by Lexipol, when you push out your update now, does it override the previous changes that were made by that department? Or does it keep those previous changes and just change the substantive law words? What does it do as far as changes that have been made already?
It doesn't change anything. It simply informs them as to what our recommended change is. And they can put it up on their screen in a side-by-side view, and it will show them, if they accept this policy change, what it would look like. And then again, they have that full creative control. So we don't change anything in an agency's policy manual without their specific direction. So even my guys that are helping them customize policy, as Sergeant Gunn knows, because I worked with him and my team worked closely with him and his folks on the San Francisco project, that was a very collaborative process where they dictated, they make the decisions. A lot of it is us making the edits for it to say what they want it to say. And as Lieutenant Cunning said, it's about codifying what the organization does and doing it in the Lexipol platform and having a very solid base of policy for them to operate off of and customize for their application.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to our final panelist for the evening is George Perez Velez. George, you've been responsible for the review and writing of 400 plus policies. Tell us some information here. Lexipol, non-Lexipol, your thoughts on their service and policies based on Lexipol. We'd love to hear from you.
So, and thank you for having me. And thank you for leaving me at the end. Lots to think about. You know, it's always good to go at the end. You hear everybody's opinions, and then, I mean, I wrote 2 pages worth of notes, which is indicative of the level of discussion here. I have to make a correction and a disclaimer. First of all, I am a board member of NACO. I'm the chair of the working group on use of force policy for organization. But any and all statements, because I'm still a member of the Berkeley Police Review Commission and the BART Police Review Board, all the statements that I make here are on my own and are not indicative of any position that either NACO, PRC, or the BPCRB are taking. Having said all that, I looked at all the questions that were given to me, and one of them was, does the Berkeley Police Department use Lexipol? Berkeley started looking at the Lexipol process in 2009. We know Lexipol was started in 2003. And we started looking at it as a way to see whether the Berkeley Police Department could engage in accreditation here in California. So that was our first introduction to the Lexipol policies. Even before the study in 2018 by Professor Schwartz, there were community concerns related about the way that the Lexipol policies were written. It is true to say that it does supply some levels of efficiency and easiness of use for the department, but our concern as a community that has always been very engaged since 1973 in police oversight is whether they were indicative of the needs of the community. We are firm believers that the community has to have a voice in how they're policed. And we did not believe that cookie cutter, so to speak, policy that came in from our organization, which Professor Schwartz is correct. It's more invested in creating discretion for the police officers more than having true community involvement in that aspect of how the community wants to be policed was the major concern to us. So this is what we did. Berkeley, through political and community pressure for 20 years, created a non-spoken agreement that any and all policies before they were implemented had to come to the PRC for discussion, vetting, and a vote. And if that process didn't work, there was always city council, and city council will get involved as well as the city manager. So we implemented a really very robust, which we always had, subcommittee working group. So for every single policy that we had, there was a new change coming in, we created a subcommittee to review it. And that entailed quite a lengthy process. For the Lexipol, because we then decided that Lexipol was going to be how we were going to proceed after establishing certain caveats of how we were going to proceed about it. We created a subcommittee, which has reviewed now in excess of 200 policies, and we're about 41 policies to go until we're fully completed. And that means a full vetting process in which we look at the original policy, you look at the Lexipol policy, which being presented by Lexipol and the department, and you also look at other policies around the nation and make a comparative study of what works, what doesn't work. And we're looking at the intent of the community voice, as well as the requirements that there be post requirements that need to be followed, legal, federal and state, as well as city ordinances, right? So those can change, but we know that the other ones can change. I have to say that not every single change in any policy requires a meet and confer. Not everything affects working conditions. So when you're looking at policies and reviewing policies, let that not be a deterrent. It sounds like, oh, we have to look at this policy, there must be a meet and confer. Not every single policy requires such a process. So let that not be a deterrent. So the committees were created either by city council referrals, either by input from the community, because our commission has the ability to do policy investigations based on complaints by citizens of our community. So we can do a policy investigation, there's a change coming on the pipeline, then we have a subcommittee and review these policies. A question was, And a perfect example of policies that you can create, not necessarily Lexipol offers, is treatment of transgender individuals. No one was talking about treatment of transgender individuals 5-6 years ago. Lexipol didn't have a policy that dealt with treatment of transgender individuals. For that fact, they didn't have a policy of treatment of homeless, and I have to say homeless for the referral to have the general orders written, not because the wording should not be unhoused. But particularly, there are some policies that did not exist within Lexipol that community members felt it was time and need to be created. So Lexipol couldn't offer any advice on those policies. So that's something you folks need to think about as well. It is true to say that Lexipol does not require that all policies have to be implemented the way they write them. Berkeley is a perfect example in terms of the fair impartial policing. We felt that the fair impartial policing policy from Lexipol was extremely deficient. So after having a year community organized work with ACLU, NAACP, Center for Policing Equity, we used the policy that we wrote on a 2-year effort and implemented that. But we kept the formatting, right? So we kept the formatting and the assigned number under Lexipol to make sure that cohesion have existed. I say that as a perfect example that you don't have to take a policy from Lexipol and put it there. You can either review it, like I said, on the 3-process review that I said, or you can say, listen, we have a much better policy that we have generated. We're going to put it there instead. There was a conversation about whether unions were at the table or not in some policies. The BART Police Citizen Review Board was the second agency in the United States who created a minimal reliance on use of force policy. I was the chair of that subcommittee at BART. The union was present in that room in every single discussion that dealt with the use of policy. And this is 2010, right? How the time flies now. Then we had to strive to use a minimal reliance of force like San Francisco does in order to start a conversation about what proportionality looked like and what minimum use of force looked like. So baby steps, now we're in different conversations now. But as a contrast, we just wrote a brand new policy for Berkeley, which changes the dynamic to say that it has to be objectively reasonable, objectively necessary, that it needs to be able to articulate the proportionality of force, and that it has to be quite descriptive on the reasonableness of how the force is used. So we took what Vanita Gupta said at a PERF conference 10 years ago and pushed it to the logical conclusion in 2021 of what a real use of force policy should look. And the reason why I say that is that Graham v. Connor, even by PERF standards on their report 10 years ago, was just the floor, not the ceiling. So no policy, whether the law tells you to write it one way or the other, should be considered the ceiling of what that law, but that policy should be. But perhaps it could be the floor. I just looked at Lexipol use of force policy 300 on their website. It makes no introduction of sanctity of life. It makes no introduction whatsoever on sanctity of life. I mean, we know that AB 392 changes things in California, but we know that SB 230 did as well. And SB 230 was extremely specific on what must be present in the use of force policy. I'll give, if I might take, just to give you an example, I mean, the sanctity of life, which is a recommendation by NACO, is sanctity of life must be a core value and a critical evaluating aspect in any policy related to uses of force by any law enforcement or correctional agency. Use of force policies must emphasize restraint, recognizing the sanctity of all human life, and requiring that all persons be treated with dignity and respect. Not even that language is not found in your Sheriff's Department language. The sanctity of life language is included, it's an SB 230 requirement, but 9 months ago, it wouldn't have been included. It was an SB 230 requirement. So even in the writing of our policy in Berkeley, we're pushing the law to the limit, right? there's nothing that says that reasonable use of force should be the only evaluating factor in writing use of force policy. If that was true, the inclusion of necessary on AB 392 would have not met the legal standard. And I'll close, sorry that I'm being extremely wordy here. I'll close on my notes. It said, you know, I would agree that Lexipol offers the formatting, start in writing, risk management, and minimizes legal liability, but that's only because it's in compliance to post requirements, state and federal laws, right? But it's very discretion heavy. I will agree with the prior speakers. I mean, and I am a firm believer then when you put more restraints in use of force, that's a perfect example. But when you create policies that are more indicative of the values of the community, it creates less liability for the police department. Because, and we know this, I mean, in BART, we've been looking at use of force reporting for the last 10 years. We can look at a quarterly use of force report every single month. You can do a monthly use report, you can do a quarterly use report. And sometimes it changes, right? We haven't seen a reduction, but what we have seen is both accountability and transparency. Accountability in terms of how the policy is being implemented, transparency for the community to see what the effects of that policy are. And I'll close by saying, you know, there are certain other examples on where Lexipol might just give you the basic guidelines. You know, is it 30 minutes to activate a camera? Is it on the body worn camera? Is it only when you're doing a law enforcement interaction with an individual? Or should you have a requirement that every single interaction with an individual be recorded? That's not specifically required or recommended by Lexipol. So it is important, again, to say that the community should have that voice. I just looked at the categorically restrained. I mean, it's most agencies in the Bay Area are going for that, and all chokeholds, not descriptions under which reasons it should be used. Napa Sheriff's Department still has it as a viable option to use of force. I mean, I'm sure that in the conversation, it might even be used as a de-escalation technique. It is not, right? So a lot of different policies can change. Lexipol, if you folks look at it as just the basic formatting and adherence to whatever the law might be at the time, as just having that specificity in there, and then have a robust system of review recommendations before implementation, then I would say to you, sure, we've been doing it for 10 years in Berkeley on that robust of a critical assessment before they're implemented, and it works in the benefit of the community, and it continues to push for sustainable and progressive policies. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of really good information. Do any of our CAC members have questions for Mr. Perez Velez? One question I did want to ask is, it seems like, you know, you said for each policy that every policy goes to the subcommittee, the Berkeley Police Review Commission. Have you found a lot of pushback from the police department or the unions about having this community input for every single policy change? Or have they been comfortable with allowing the public and the community to be heard as the policy changes are made?
So that's a good question. You know, before Lexipol was implemented as a process, if there was a change that was coming, we would have a subcommittee based on that. If there are any transformative changes, substantive changes on how the policies are written, for example, compliance with SB 230 was one that took it out of the Lexipol subcommittee into its own subcommittee for it to be vetted more thoroughly. What we did with the Lexipol subcommittee was to compare the original policy to the policy in existence, to the policy that was being proposed, for us to be able to make sure that the intent of the community needs were satisfied. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. in one of the Lexipol policies dealing with domestic violence. It says an officer may give information to the victim of the crime on possible services to be provided after the incident. We think that that is completely unacceptable. So we said it should be a should and a shall. Now, Lexipol defines shall and should quite interesting, right? A shall means it shall be done. A should means that it has to be done, but the officer has to be able to articulate a reason for failure to comply. So for us, having to say a should, of course, you should give the victim of a hate crime, of the victim of a domestic violence crime, the information needed for extra services. Of course, you should give that. But to answer your question more directly, and there are policies which might require a more thorough vetting, like the use of force policy, fair and impartial policing, policies on body-worn camera. I mean, policies on warrant serving of warrants and seizures. I mean, uses of force to affect an arrest, things like that. But we know that most policies are written either of our personal conduct and duty requirements, uniform equipment regulations, and otherwise the duties and responsibilities, right? So some of them could be completely administrative. So you don't need it. You don't need to have such a big vetting. But having the voice in the comparative study of how that policy is going to be implemented and written is what the critical aspect here in accepting the introduction of the Lexipol into your own processes.
Thank you very much. Are there any panelists, before we open to public comment, are there any of the other panelists who have been listening and have some additional comments either for the CAC or for in response to some of the other panelists? Does anybody have anything else to add before we open it up to the public?
Yeah, but if you wouldn't mind, Bill, for Lexipol here, I wouldn't mind clarifying a couple of points. Just the most recent statement about Lexipol's policy not protecting the sanctity of life. One thing to be very cautious about when you say Lexipol's policies is if you're looking at an agency policy manual, like I said, agencies have the ability to customize policy to their level and how they want it to read. And I can tell you that the Lexipol policy for use of force does say that we recognize and respect the value of human life and dignity without prejudice to anyone. So if that language was removed from an agency's policies, that's up to the agency to determine that. So I can tell you that the Lexipol master content is what we call it for each state, does take that stance and is very much about the preservation of life and civil liberties and respecting individuals. So just cautioning some people of saying Lexipol's policies say, if you're looking at an agency's policy manual, know that it's customized and the agency could take that stuff out. We don't necessarily recommend it, but they don't have to follow our guidelines, right? Even when we push out updates, those updates do come with what we call release notes. It was mentioned before, we just push out the updates and we don't give any edification behind those. We do. Every agency and Sergeant Gunn and Lieutenant Cutting can comment. When those updates come out, they do come out with what we call release notes to give some background of those changes for people to consider. And the only other last thing I'll say is, when you're looking at organizations like the Policing Project and others, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. Organizations like that work very well and complement something like Lexipol, and we work with organizations and folks all around the country from different aspects, and it complements whether you're accredited through CALIA or a state accreditation process or what have you. Lexipol complements all that, and when you bring it all in, we welcome that, and Lexipol has always pushed and recommended that agencies have that openness and involvement of not only other members of the community, but groups like the Policing Project and such that are out there, PERF, you name it, that can lend assistance to their vetting process and their, again, full vetting and creating policy that is truly applicable, practical, and functional to their needs, not just taking what Lexipol provides them. It's not an off-the-shelf product. It's a service, it's a partnership, and it's a really solid foundation for any agency to work from. Like I said, San Francisco, very unique agency, very unique application. We spent thousands of hours working with San Francisco to get that policy tuned the way that they wanted it. And there was a lot of involvement at all sorts of levels within the agency. And, but we also work with agencies that are, one chief or one sheriff and one deputy and one officer, that kind of thing. So it applies and it's all scalable, but it is, again, it's all customizable. And lexible master content is not necessarily what you're seeing in an agency's policy manual online that has been modified by that agency.
Bill, as a follow-up, this is Evan Zelig. Are there agencies, I know you work with a lot of very large agencies who do take, the hours to make modifications. Do you also work with agencies, however, that simply approve the Lexipol updates as they're put out? Okay, here's the Lexipol master list. Here's our master content, approved. That's our new policy. Do you know what percentage of your clients do just have the master content as their policy?
No, we don't. But I can tell you that our position to any customer and every customer is, it is not the off-the-shelf solution. You have to go through these and make sure that what your policy says matches your practices. If you don't have policy and practice conformance, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And when Lexipol talks about mitigating risk by using Lexipol, it's about having sound policy so that your people act within policy, which is within the law, which is within community expectations, all those other quantifiers. So they're out doing the right thing when they're engaging with your community. Therefore, they don't have the level of complaints. They're not doing bad things. They're gonna either get somebody hurt or cause a complaint or a lawsuit or harm to somebody. So it's not about Lexipol mitigating risk by getting you off from a lawsuit or making you slippery so you can't be sued. It's about making sure that you have policies that are on point with how you want to run your organization, how your community expects you to operate, what the law requires you to do, and then again, make sure you have, as Sergeant Dunn talked about, the daily training bulletins. That's the other critical piece of Lexipol is you can have great policies. You can write the best policies in the world, but if you don't train your people on it, then they're more likely not going to act within policy. So when you have good policies, you train your people on those policies, and then policy is in the forefront of their mind, they're much more likely to act and react within policy. And that's when they treat your citizens right. They don't violate the law. They don't overstep their bounds. They don't do things that trigger animosity between the citizenry and the police department, or complaints or lawsuits or injuries or loss of life. So it's all about making sure people do the right thing.
If those two are so interconnected, the drafting of the policies and the use of the daily bulletins, why is that only an add-on and not included in the policy updates?
Yeah, it actually is. Lexipol, as I said, started in California. And when they first started, you could select whether you wanted just the policies or policies and daily training bulletins. Several years ago, can't remember what year it was, but several years ago, we did away with that model, and every agency that subscribes to Lexipol gets the policies and the daily training bulletins. Whether they elect to activate them and actually release them to their people, that's up to them, because the daily training bulletins have to be validated against their released policy, because they're written from our perspective based on our master content. Every agency then needs to make sure they're validated so that the training is actually on point with what their policy says, because we want them training on their policy, not on our master content. So there is a little bit of a process there. And then again, that validation process, and then they can push them out to their people. They have full accountability. They know who's taking the training, who's not taking the training. They can go back into the archives and they can see how much training people have had on those particular topics or that policy. So there's a lot of accountability built in that too. Again, making sure that people are educated on the policy and are actually going out into the community and acting within the guidelines that have been set by the chief executive and the group that they assemble to craft those policies.
Thank you. Annie, I know before Bill started talking, you had some additional comments as well.
I just wanted to clarify that, and I appreciate Sergeant Cutting was saying, that their policy has a lot of the same provisions as the Camden policy. I just want to be clear that while a lot of larger agencies have adopted more progressive and more responsive use of force policies, that we aren't saying that's the Lexipol policy. The Lexipol policy actually remains, the Connor baseline. So, and to the extent that Professor Schwartz was saying, decisions are made already by the time you're seeing the Lexipol policy. So it's wonderful when an agency is able to bring in someone like us or a group that is educated on the full, has had the time to put in the work. This is my full-time job to review all the various policies that are out there. But that takes a lot. And sometimes when you're presented with one version of it, it takes quite a lot to find the alternatives if you're using this as your starting point. So I do just want to flag that while we're thrilled to work with any organization that we have the capacity to work with, it does create a baseline that you're working with where decisions are already made, as Professor Schwartz said.
Thank you very much. Okay, if there are no additional comments to add, I think what we'll do at this point is open it up to public comment. And if you do wish to make public comments, we're going to open it up at this point. Please state your name and who you represent. Comments are going to be limited to 3 minutes. And again, this public comment is going to be as it relates to our current CAC discussion, our current panel on these Lexipol policies and the topics brought up by our panelists. So I do see that we have a few people wanting to make public comment. Jerry Threet, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead, and once you are permitted to speak, please go ahead and we'll begin the counter.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Very interesting panel. Thank you for it. You've heard consistent information from the Lexipol folks and also the folks that have some criticism of Lexipol. And the bottom line is that Lexipol provides a very valuable service in informing agencies, and especially smaller ones, what the minimum policies that will help protect them from legal liability under developing case law. But what it does not provide in any sense are key policies that represent developing best practices to protect the public and ensure public health and safety, which often go above the minimum legal requirements. The entire point of policy is to limit employee discretion, and that's why we have policy. However, there are many other sources that help a police agency develop policies that best serve the communities they provide police services to. As a bottom line, as many have said, you must go to the community and ask what they would like to guide the policing of their communities. That's the primary input that should go into any policy, just as the President's 21st Century Policing Report recommended. But beyond consulting with the community, there are many sources of best practices for policing policies, as agencies across the country have increasingly adopted better policies in democratic consultation with their communities. Berkeley is one recent example. In addition, input from organizations like the ACLU are important. Federal consent decrees represent a panoply of best practices for key policing policies, such as use of force, bias-free policing, and the like. In addition, policy recommendations made by civilian oversight agencies across the country are another good source of best practices. And these sources are more likely to explore the various arguments for and against these approaches. So my strong advice to the CAC, as they said in the Mandalorian TV series, this is the way. To the CAC, I would say, please consider this as the way of proceeding and making key policy recommendations when you speak to the Sheriff's Office about what the community's desires are. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. The next person we're going to call, I saw this hand raised from very early on, Alexis Borelli. Alexis Borelli.
Hi, I just wanted to, as a citizen, state how concerned I am that at no point during any of the questions that were being asked to the professional from Lexipol did he give a direct and concise answer. Instead, he used a lot of political language that danced around any affirmative or any negative comments at all. It really felt like we got this very kind of really not even intelligible idea of what Lexipol does and what it would provide for our communities, because ultimately the Sheriff's Office, the police department are supposed to provide support to our community. We have seen a lot of issues with the Sheriff's Department and the police department over the years, but what you're saying is your company essentially just goes, oh, hey, we're going to put this into a better format. But then there's also a lot of concerning policies regarding Lexipol to begin with. including the fact that it seems like your company is put in place so that there's less liability and as a screen between the police and being held accountable for their actions. So I really don't understand how much of the police budget is going to this, but it sounds a lot like the police are inept at keeping track of their own records and policy changes, which is part of their job. So they have to hire an outside resource, which then ultimately we as a community pay for because we pay their salaries. So it sounds a lot like this is a way for police to kind of get around having to do their job and not really accept any responsibility. Ultimately, I think this is just a waste of taxpayer money and a waste of time. And I'm very confused as to what Lexipol even does, because like I said, your representative gave us absolutely no information. It was a dance and honestly very boring to listen to. And I just don't even understand what exactly this company does at this point. And that's all I have to say. I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, thank you. The next person is listed online through Zoom as Bibs, B-I-B-S. Go ahead and speak when you are permitted to do so on the app.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Lovely. I'm glad that we're talking about Lexipol today, but I have some things that were really concerning to me. And one of the things was that Brandon Cutting, you were mentioning that you didn't necessarily have to use all of the suggestions that Lexipol had. And if you were really, that's good and fine. I don't think that we should necessarily take a base form from people that are trying to give you the easiest time with litigation stuff. But you still kind of have 9.5 million in litigation fees for a bunch of other nonsense that y'all did, and human rights abuses and violations, and that still isn't being talked about. And these abuses happened under your policy. I think moving forward, you really have to address these human rights violations. The report has been out for around 6 months, 7 months, maybe longer. Why don't we know about it? This is a problem. I yield my time.
Thank you very much. The next person we'll have for public comment is Laura Sparks.
Hello, my name is Laura Sparks. I'm a Cotati City Council member. I'm speaking here today just as a private citizen, though. I just wanted to thank you so much for tackling this topic as a council member in a really small community. It's something where we wouldn't have had the resources to pull together such an amazing group of panelists to have a good discussion. And I just really appreciate that. And also to Joanna Schwartz. I did read your article last summer. I actually emailed it to all my city council members who are now my colleagues. So I know they've all read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next individual is Allegra Wilson. Allegra, once you're allowed in, please go ahead with your public comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, I wanted to say I really appreciate that this topic was being introduced here and that the panel has representation beyond just law enforcement and their perspective. I think it's interesting the way it was put that our sheriff's office is a part of community and therefore that's the community involvement. I think anyone has to admit that they have a very specific point of view. So it's one small subsection of the community. I wouldn't necessarily consider it the community at large or anything. And I feel like it's very frustrating to continuously hear how hard it is for law enforcement to create and maintain policy and procedure around the laws that they're enforcing within our community. That just doesn't ring true to me. I hear that time and money is a concern. However, perhaps some of the budget of the sheriff's office could go to creating appropriate policy and procedure instead of going to purchase a off-the-shelf kind of situation where you're basically just doing CYA, including the daily bulletins, which seem like, a very neat little checkbox to prove that everybody has been trained and is doing things appropriately without a lot of follow-up around that. It sounds to me like the project where complaints were reduced by 95% is the best possible level of risk management. That's only if you're getting that many fewer complaints, that means you're way less open to liability. So it just makes sense to go with something more in that model rather than continuing with the Lexipol model. So I do hope that that contract is reconsidered. And I appreciate the time tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Lamont, Susan Lamont, we're gonna have you for public comment.
Thank you. This was great. I need to clarify something that Officer Cutting said about community involvement. Under the previous director of the CAC, community involvement was extremely robust. We could work with ad hoc committees. Our input was taken all the time. And the result of that was that first, the sheriff's representative started refusing to answer questions from the community. And eventually, the sheriff's representative refused to come to meetings. That did not change until new director Navarro took over and community involvement was completely hamstrung. So that the belief that the sheriff's office is cooperative in this is a total falsehood. So that said, I'd like to comment on the legal liability issue. It seems to me that that broader standard that is used results in not necessarily saving the agency money, the county money. What it does is it gets the officers off the hook. It's very difficult for the DA to charge an officer with anything because the standards are so broad. So the result is then we end up with civil trials, which then end up actually with settlements, and counties had many millions of dollars of these. Seems to me just one fewer settlement and the sheriff's office could hire somebody to monitor all law changes and do what Lexipol does. I'd also want to add that Sheriff Essick has already stated that he doesn't think the sheriff's office should be held to best practices because we're so small, we're so rural, and he thinks he doesn't believe that it should be held to that. And I don't know if Annie can answer a question. I wondered if her group is big enough to handle helping very many agencies, and if there are others, because it seems that you wouldn't, there's so many agencies, you wouldn't be able to help very many. And it's such a valuable service that you offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. We're going to go next to Michael. Michael Titone or Titoni. Go ahead, Michael.
So it sounds to me like regardless of what the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office decides to implement in terms of policies and how Lexipol advises them on those policies, the legal recommendations of Lexipol tend to favor language that keeps officer accountability low. It's about risk management, and keeping risk low is an actual selling point for Lexipol. This is based on what I've heard from many of the panelists. This is not just achieved through officer education. It's also achieved through the specific language choices that are used to draft policies, the specific definitions that are employed. And that's very concerning because whereas, for private companies, you don't, often you're operating from a self-interested perspective. Risk isn't a bad thing in the public sphere because it provides an actual incentive for public officials to follow the law and protect the public. And so we really want to make sure that there is accountability, and that accountability comes from actually working with the community, not, trying to make sure that lawsuits remain low. It sounds to me like there also wasn't an exploration of alternatives, or a very sufficient one, when the sheriff's office decided to consult with Lexipol. So I would recommend that we don't go with Lexipol until we've really explored alternatives here, because we do want to keep our officers accountable to the public. That should be one of our primary goals, especially with Iolero being sheriff's oversight. There are obviously concerns about Lexipol from this panel, and concerns that weren't necessarily refuted by any of the panelists. I'd personally be in favor of Iolero playing a stronger role in advising the sheriff about policies and the policy language, because unlike Lexipol, there isn't as much of a bias because there's no interest in protecting clients. There's no interest in selling the low risk as a factor. And so I would, obviously we want officers to follow the law. That's the most important thing. We want officers to be held accountable too. I'm going to yield the rest of my time. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I don't see any additional members of our public who want to give public comment at this time. Oh, okay, Veronica Cruz, this will be the last public comment that we take on this subject. So I did see one hand go up for Veronica Cruz.
Good evening, and I would like to thank Iolero for bringing this panel to their meeting tonight, and it was very insightful. I just have a couple comments. To me, this Lexipol is a private company that makes money from police agencies. And of course, they're going to write their policies that are going to support them, the hand that feeds them. And I agree with Ms. Schwartz, and I'm glad she pointed this out in the beginning, is that it's about reducing the liability and exposure. And then there's also an opportunity for the agency to write in carve-outs to protect their officers even further, to give that doubt, to give them the gray area that they need to be protected. And that's where that ambiguous part, where if the officer feels in their mind that, they should have used reasonable force. I just really wish that it was really clear cut when that happens. And that's where the community gets involved. You got to listen to the community, and our community here in Sonoma County, I'm sure, is much different than Frisco, Texas, and we're as different as the 58 counties that we have. So give kudos to the police departments that are actually listening to community and involving them and taking them into consideration. And I also want to thank Annie Hudson and her group for the work that they're doing. It sounds like we need to do more of that here. Please come out to California. I don't know, it just, as a person who's a citizen and just driving along in my car, I just want to make sure that when I'm pulled over, that person that's interacting with me is going to be fair and serving and protecting me as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you to all of our panelists this evening. Joanna Schwartz, Sergeant Gunn, Bill McAuliffe, Annie Hudson Price, Brandon Cutting, and George Perez Velez. Thank you all. Your information has really been fantastic. I know that the CAC, what we'll be doing in our smaller ad hoc meetings is discussing this much further to shape our recommendations to the Sheriff's Department as far as the policy changes that our community and that the CAC would like to see implemented. So thank you very much. Excuse me. You are all free to leave the meeting if you choose to do so. You're welcome to stay and join us for what remains. But thank you very much for all of your participation.
Thank you for inviting me. It was enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now on our next agenda item, we do have something that says mission statement ideas. Looking at the time, I note that it is now 8:30, which is well beyond our meeting time for the typical meeting. I would also note that I have not received any communications from our CAC members of any emails or ideas for our mission statement. So with the permission of those who are still joining us on the CAC, and just checking with Adriana, What I'd like to do is perhaps move this item of the mission statement ideas to our next meeting, because I'd really like the CAC members to think of mission statements and perhaps send them to myself, the chair, and to Ms. Navarro, so that we can kind of get a sense of people's thoughts for the mission statements. Don't email them to everybody, but if you could email your ideas to either me or Adriana or Carlene, we can kind of get that started for the next meeting and then have more of a discussion at that point. Is that okay with the rest of our members?
Yes.
Okay. I will still open it up, of course, to public comments at the end, which I'm going to open up just in a few moments. We're going to take public comments from our public community. And if our public has comments regarding the mission statement ideas, please feel free to comment on that now or at the next meeting when we will address that in more detail as well. I know that was something we added on to this agenda item based on our last meeting. Unfortunately, tonight, I don't think we have the time to really spend the time that this mission statement deserves. So let's put that till the next one. And in the meantime, we'll get some further input from our community and the other CAC members. It's probably best to have this discussion as well when we have more of us available as well. Okay, I am now going to open up our meeting to general public comment. This is for public comment on anything, both agenda items as well as those items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the CAC. All are encouraged to engage in respectful communication that supports freedom of speech. Please adhere to our commitment to civil engagement and our and all of the information from previous meetings as far as our commitment to civil engagement and the rules and regulations of our meetings and public comment. And we'll open that up. I see a phone line beginning with 707, 703. Please go ahead when you are permitted to talk.
Hi, it's Jim Duffy, certified practitioner of oversight by NACOL. I served on the Community Advisory Council for 3 years. I want to start off by thanking all of you for an excellent panel this evening. I am going to address my first comment to that panel issue. I didn't want to go then because I knew you were running late. One of your members talked about where do we go to find information on use of force if we don't have Lexipol. We had a use of force community working group that we created. We put letters to the editor in the Press Democrat and Bohemian, and we advertised on public media, on social media, and we got 14 community members who met for two times a month for 6 months to talk about the use of force recommendations that came out of that CAC back then. And, you know, we had PERF and IACP and model policies from San Francisco and Salt Lake City and Las Vegas and Seattle. I mean, you know, you pay attention, you're on the CAC, you pay attention to this kind of stuff, you get to know who are the communities that have the best policies out there. There's also a great public health paper out of the university, at a Berkeley School of Public Health that you all should be reading. And law review articles and consent decrees. I mean, good Lord, there's so much information out there. So if you have trouble getting started, ask me, and I'm happy to get your role in. You know, you could spend forever reading on it. Unfortunately, we were locked out. Susan Lamont hinted at that after Jerry Threet did the recommendations for the 36 recommendations for the sheriff to improve their internal administrative investigations. They did not like that, and they locked us out for the last year that we were on the CAC. I was on the CAC, and, you know, he was in office. So that's something we don't have to worry about with Measure P. So go for it. Second thing, I want to request that when I send an email to cac@sonomacounty.org, that email go to all the members of the CAC and not just the chair and the co-chair. I found out recently, I thought when I was emailing the CAC, I was emailing the CAC, and that's not the case. And I think the public should have a mechanism to communicate with all of you, not a two-way communication, but a notification to you in between. And also, now that you are independent of the staff for these agendas, I'm going to suggest that you go back to doing what the CAC did with the staff at that time for the first 2 years of its functioning, and that is have board dockets. Have some material ahead of time that goes out to people to get them a little keyed in to the information. And for this meeting, it could have been some Lexipol marketing materials and paper out of the Texas Law Review. It could be as simple as that, but something so that people aren't coming to your meeting fresh, so that they can be a little educated. It's going to be really important when you guys do the Blue Lives Matter, the thin blue line discussion that you're having down the road. That's going to be a really heated discussion, and people on both sides feel like their position is the right one. So it would be good for people to have a little information so they could at least read where the other side's coming from. Thank you so much again for the great discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jim. And Adriana, yeah, one thing that Jim did mention, I was not aware that not all of us receive an email when it's sent to CAC. If that is definitely something I think should be made available to all of us. If an email goes to that address, it should go to everybody. Okay, the last public comment that I see is Kelsey Vero. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But Kelsey, go ahead when you are permitted to do so. I'll set the timer for 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I'm just jumping on the meeting here. Thank you for having this discussion on Lexipol. I know that the ILRO had, I think it was the interns working on the issue as well and digging into it. I think the problem is that it really needs digging into because it's deep, it goes far, it's very vague in places, it's hard to understand, it's written in this way that is designed to obfuscate and to make it more difficult to pick apart. And I want to see as much sunlight on this as possible. I don't think it's easy to understand why a private company would be in control of something so important and would have such a lack of responsiveness to local communities as a barrier to making changes when we see, for example, something that we've seen recently and long ago and all the time, regular incidents that we want to respond to, and that it's appropriate to respond to when there's use of force, when there's been deaths at the hands of police, and having anything be a greater barrier to that is inappropriate for any level of convenience. I would love to see more discussion on this and for that contract to be just ended so that the policies can be written for our community and in response to the needs of the community. Yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to say. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was our last community member who wanted to give public comment for today's meeting. Again, thank you to all of our panelists who were able to join us. It was a lot of really great information about Lexipol and some of the reasons that communities and agencies choose Lexipol, as well as those who choose to not rely on it as much as others. Definitely information for us to take and use in our ad hocs in looking at these policies and making future recommendations. Certainly knowing where the agencies are starting and being able to make modifications from there and knowing what updates they're receiving is helpful. And yeah, let's continue these discussions in our ad hocs. And of course, we will take them to heart and mind when we make our recommendations. So thank you everybody for joining us for today's and this month's meeting. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.